So, you think you would have made it during the gold rush? Cute. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1849. You've sold your house, kissed your family goodbye, and just spent 3 months in a wagon being chased by dysentery and disappointment. But it's fine, because someone told you there's gold in a river. Somewhere. Welcome to a land of muddy tents, overpriced eggs, and dreams that crumble faster than soggy bread. Tonight, we're going back to the rush that built California and broke just about everyone else. So grab your shovel, or don't. You probably wouldn't last a week anyway. If you value these quiet moments of history, consider supporting this space by liking or subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. It helps keep the stories flowing. There's something comforting about knowing who's out there, listening in the stillness. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you there. Now, lower the lights, allow your breath to slow, and let the quiet settle in. Gold wasn't supposed to be part of the plan. That is, unless your plan was to quietly build an agricultural empire and suddenly wake up to find thousands of strangers camping on your lawn. That's more or less what happened to Johann Sutter in early 1848, when a carpenter named James Marshall was scouting out a site for a sawmill along the American River. One morning, Marshall noticed something glinting in the water. He scooped up a few flakes, squinted at them, and honestly, probably sighed. Because even if he wasn't certain, some deep part of him must have known. This wouldn't stay quiet for long. Of course, they tried to keep it a secret for about 5 minutes. But gold, especially when it's real, shiny, and free for the picking, has a curious way of refusing to stay a secret. Word spread through the nearby towns like wildfire, helped along by the kind of enthusiastic storytelling that tends to leave out things like back-breaking labor and probably won't strike it rich. Within weeks, the first prospectors, mostly local Californios, and a trickle of Mexican laborers, began arriving at Sutter's mill. Then came 1849. By the time news reached the East Coast later that year, traveling by ship, horseback, and a lot of breathless exaggeration, California had gone from sleepy frontier to glittering daydream. Suddenly, the idea of cold, muddy rivers full of gold dust didn't seem far-fetched. It seemed inevitable. Newspapers ran headlines that made even the most skeptical clerk consider swapping their inkwell for a pickaxe. And swap they did. Storekeepers left their shops. Farmers abandoned crops mid-season. Doctors, lawyers, sailors, soldiers. Entire professions turned into punchlines as men, mostly men, though not exclusively, dropped everything to chase the golden mirage. The term 49ers wasn't just a nickname. It was practically a personality type. If you were breathing in 1849 and had access to a shovel, you were probably considering California. The journey west came in 2 flavors, grueling and slightly more grueling. Some took their chances overland, joining wagon trains that snaked through prairies, deserts, and mountain passes. Picture oxen plodding steadily forward while your boots dissolve into dust and your patience into vapor. Others opted for the sea route, sailing all the way around Cape Horn or heading for Panama, where they'd hike across the isthmus, swat at mosquitoes for a few days, and catch another ship up the coast. Either way, it was a choose-your-own adventure, where every option included discomfort, disease, and the lingering feeling you'd made a terrible mistake. If you made it to San Francisco, and that was a big if, you'd arrive in a city that was, to put it politely, unprepared. At the start of 1848, San Francisco was a quiet town of just a few hundred people. Blink and you'd miss it. But by the end of 1849, that quiet had been replaced with chaos. Tents and hastily built shacks sprang up like mushrooms after a storm. Population estimates skyrocketed to over 25,000. And here's where things get surreal. Because so many ships arrived in the harbor and so few sailors stuck around to do things like, sail back, the vessels were simply abandoned. Hundreds of them left bobbing listlessly in the bay like forgotten toys in a bathtub. Some were repurposed as warehouses, prisons, floating hotels. Others just sat there, a haunting outline of just how many people had dropped their normal lives to roll the dice in California. It was as if the entire world had tilted slightly on its axis. In Europe, people read about the gold fields and packed their bags. Australia, China, Chile, news spread like spilled mercury across a map. An estimated 300,000 people would eventually descend on California during the rush. Imagine that, a human tidal wave drawn not by conquest or famine, but by glitter. And glitter it was. Not the kind you shake out of a craft bin, but the kind that lives in riverbeds and dreams. In the hills and streams of the Sierra Nevada, prospectors waded knee-deep in icy waters, swirling pans full of mud and hope. Some found enough to cover their journey's cost. A lucky few struck rich, most didn't. But fortune was never really the full story. It was the possibility of fortune, that slim, intoxicating chance, like buying a lottery ticket that takes 6 months and 3 pairs of boots to redeem. Back east, cities noticed. Men were vanishing, businesses shuttering, families splintering. Letters from sons and husbands spoke of promise, hardship, sometimes nothing at all. The sheer emptiness felt in places like St. Louis or Boston didn't just come from physical distance. It was the emotional gravity California exerted. It was centrifugal force in real time. Whole communities pulled toward a single twinkling point on the map. And yet, for every person chasing gold, there were 10 more chasing the people chasing gold. Enterprising minds back home realized, with a gleam rivaling any river pebble, that the real money might lie not in mining, but in mining the miners, selling tools, tents, coffee, boots. Some of the most successful figures of the gold rush wouldn't swing a pick once. They just sell the dream, one overpriced shovel at a time. But in those first months, that nuance hadn't settled in. What had settled in, like sand in your boot or smoke in your lungs, was contagion. Not a literal disease, though there were plenty of those, but gold fever, a kind of collective madness. Rational people boarded rickety ships on the strength of rumors. Fathers left families. Teenagers lied about their age. Logic got replaced with lust, for fortune, for status, for reinvention, because underneath all the gold talk, that's what the rush offered most clearly. A chance to start over. In a country already drunk on manifest destiny, the idea that a muddy river in the West could make you into someone entirely new was irresistible. You didn't need a pedigree to pan for gold. You didn't need charm, connections, or even a last name people could spell. You just needed hands, a little grit, and enough blind hope to ignore the obvious, that everyone else had the same idea. And so the trails filled. The ships emptied, the cities sighed. And California? California waited, a speck on the far edge of the continent, about to be transformed by a glittering promise and the thunderous echo of feet chasing it. They left with a shovel and a dream. Or sometimes just the dream, hoping they'd find a shovel along the way. In the spring of 1849, you might have seen a man standing in the doorway of his New York tailor shop, staring at a newspaper with a headline practically vibrating off the page. Gold in California. His name might be Thomas. He might have 3 children, a business with reliable but not thrilling returns, and a wife who very reasonably asked what, exactly, he planned to eat while panning for gold in a riverbank 3,000 miles away. He didn't have a good answer, but he had sold his shop by the following Tuesday. That was the thing about gold. It bypassed logic. A glint of it could tilt a life off its foundations. Across oceans and continents, the idea of California shimmered through foggy minds and foggier futures. In the streets of Paris, students who should have been finishing law degrees were instead pawning their books and scouring maps they didn't entirely understand. In Lima, Peru, young men kissed their mothers goodbye with promises of riches and safe returns, neither of which would come easily. In New Orleans, German immigrants who'd only just gotten off the boat were turning around and boarding steamers for San Francisco, ready to chase a second American dream before they'd even finished the first one. Many didn't own much to begin with. Some sold their family farms, land held for generations, for a chance at something brighter than another season of crop failure. Others borrowed money from cousins, uncles, anyone with a pulse and a wallet, swearing loyalty and future repayable riches. Spoiler: the uncles rarely got a refund. And even those who didn't go themselves became part of the migration. Wives, mothers, sweethearts, they were the anchors left behind in hastily packed homes, clutching letters with postmarks from St. Joseph or Panama, their hearts somewhere in the dust beyond the Missouri River. Some tried to detour the madness, mocking the whole thing as a golden delusion. But it's hard to argue with hope, especially when it's glittering. Most who left had never swung a pickaxe in their lives. They knew even less about geology, but they knew how to dream. And they dreamed hard. Advertisements promised unbelievable fortunes for the taking. Gold dust thicker than wheat in Kansas, one flyer claimed, which was mostly a lie and also geographically confusing, but it worked. Outfitters made it worse or better, depending on your perspective. They sold gold rush kits like it was a camping trip on steroids. Tin pans, wool blankets, a pick, a guidebook written by someone who'd clearly never left Ohio, all for the low, confidence-inflating price of $25. Some included a Bible, some included a gun, all included false hope, neatly rolled into canvas. The choices were rarely simple. Fathers had to decide between staying to raise their children and going to afford them a better life. Sons begged for permission to leave, promising they'd return with pockets full of gold and a better reputation with the neighbor's daughter. Families wept at docks and depots, some clinging to the belief that it was only a year or two, which in fairness was technically true for those who gave up early or died. And then there were the adventurers, the ones who didn't leave anyone or anything behind because they'd never really had anything to begin with. Drifters, gamblers, third sons with no inheritance and too many opinions. California wasn't just a destination, it was a reinvention machine. You could sail into San Francisco as a failed poet and introduce yourself 2 days later as a mining consultant. No one would question it. They were all too busy doing the same thing. Travel agents, yes, even in 1849, there was someone trying to upsell you on a ticket, catered to every sort of hopeful. The overland routes were popular for the rugged or the romantically misinformed. But for those with a bit of cash or an aversion to oxen, sea travel beckoned. Some took the long way around South America, circling Cape Horn with a prayer and an iron stomach. Others tried their luck with the Panama shortcut, a sweaty, disease-riddled trek through jungle and bureaucracy. It was faster, technically, assuming you survived the mosquitoes and didn't lose your boots in the mud. Still, they came. Driven by rumor, by letters from Cousin Joe, who said he'd seen nuggets the size of walnuts, by stories printed and reprinted until they became gospel. The fever spread through towns like a particularly enthusiastic sermon, except instead of salvation, it promised a cabin in the Sierra foothills and enough gold to buy back your past mistakes. And for what it's worth, they believed it. That was the most Californian thing of all. Belief. That just over the next ridge, just past that next bend in the river, fortune would be waiting with a grin and an open purse. That one lucky strike could erase a lifetime of bad decisions, or at the very least pay off that loan to Uncle Henry. They didn't know what awaited them. How could they? There were no satellite images, no Yelp reviews for frontier saloons, only word of mouth, and even that was often missing a few details, like how cold it got in the mountains, or how many other people had also heard about the secret spot near the Yuba River, or how you might end up spending more on boots than you ever found in your pan. But gold was never just about gold. It was about the story of gold. The idea that the next chapter of your life could start with a gamble and end with glory. That, after everything, after droughts, debt, dead ends, and disappointment, there might still be something glittering on the horizon. So they packed, quietly, quickly, sometimes tearfully, with hope, with fear, with dramatic letters left on kitchen tables, promising to write, to return, to be different. Some did, most didn't, but all of them, every last one, made a choice to roll the dice, to leave. And somewhere in the Atlantic, leaning on the creaky railing of a crowded steamship, a young man with blisters on his hands would squint westward into the fog, clutching his overpacked canvas bag, and whisper to no one, "Just a few more weeks, and I'll be rich." "Sure, pal. Just a few more weeks." There were so many ways to get to California in 1849 that it almost seemed like a test. How badly do you want the gold? Badly enough to risk dysentery in a wagon train, fevers in Panama, a 6-month sea voyage around the South Pole? Congratulations, you may already be halfway broke. Despite the options, none of them were easy. Let's start with the overland route, perhaps the most famously grueling. Picture this. You've sold your belongings, kissed the city goodbye, and set off in a creaking canvas-covered wagon that smells vaguely of damp biscuits and too many expectations. You're crossing rivers that don't really want to be crossed, deserts that radiate heat like a grudge, and mountains that look at your little wagon like a snack. Along the way, you meet other hopefuls, families, loners, young men with more courage than planning skills. There are oxen that move at exactly the wrong pace, nights too quiet to sleep, and the occasional rattlesnake wishing you weren't there. Wagon wheels break. Shoes fall apart. People vanish. And yet, Day after day, drawn by a whisper of unimaginable wealth, you keep going. Some of the travelers knew the dangers. Others had no concept of what Sierra Nevadas in December might mean. Imagine cresting a ridge only to see snowdrifts taller than your dreams. Now imagine your only option is to go forward, because turning back isn't just hard, it's impossible. The trail has closed behind you as if the land itself has decided you're committed. You push forward, your fingers cracked from cold, your food reduced to whatever you thought wouldn't spoil, which turns out to be almost nothing. Still, people did it, thousands of them. Why? Because somewhere out there, a man claimed to dig up a gold nugget the size of his fist with nothing but a spoon and sheer entitlement. And then there were the sea routes. Romantic in theory, sailing into the horizon, wind in your hair, adventure in your chest. In practice, however, it was less wind in your hair and more 6 months of salted meat, and everyone slowly turning into a different version of seasick. The long route meant going around Cape Horn, the stormy tip of South America. Ships could be stuck in those waters for weeks, swirling in circles while passengers prayed for the wind to change or the vomit to stop. If you didn't know how bad seasickness could get, spending weeks near Cape Horn would be your very thorough and very damp education. Even seasoned sailors dreaded that passage. The ocean there didn't just rock you, it judged you. Conditions on board were rarely better than the journey itself. You were packed into damp quarters with strangers whose hygiene routines had been surrendered somewhere around Cuba. Rats cheered as your dried biscuits crumbled into edible confetti. Drinking water turned brackish. Tempers flared. If you were lucky, you landed in San Francisco with only mild scurvy and a deep personal understanding of why pirates were always so cranky. For those unwilling to spend half a year at sea, or possibly age several decades rounding South America, there was the Panama shortcut, which appeared faster on a map, but in reality came with its own flavor of misery. Travelers would disembark on the Atlantic side of Panama, then attempt to cross the isthmus on foot, by mule, or in a dugout canoe. The jungle was lush, yes, but also alive with mosquitoes, large enough to negotiate. The humidity was unkind, and waiting like a final boss in a fever dream. Yellow fever, cholera, dysentery. A whole menu of 19th century threats to your digestive system and will to live. The lucky ones made it across and caught a ship on the Pacific side. The others, well, let's just say the jungle wasn't as picky as the gold fields. Despite the risks, the promise of gold kept people moving. Reports trickled back from the west, some true, most exaggerated, of men striking it rich in hours, of gold so plentiful it clung to your boots. These tales had the seductive logic of a lottery ticket. Someone had to win. Why not you? So people kept coming. They arrived sunburned, rail-thin, and squinting with equal parts exhaustion and blind hope. Some stumbled off ships with pants falling off and hats held together by sweat and stubbornness. Others reached the California coast looking like ghosts who had seen too many sunsets without water. And yet, even after all that, their eyes gleamed because they had made it. Whatever came next, digging, disappointment, delirium, that part was up to them. They were close enough now to believe that just over the next hill, or under that oddly promising rock, there might be the nugget that changed everything. Of course, no one ever arrived in California quite the same as when they left. Journeys like these carved shapes out of people. chipped away the softness, polished the determination, maybe dulled some illusions along the way. But they gave people the one thing all gold rushers needed: a story. And in that world, having the story meant you were still alive, which frankly already put you ahead of a significant number of your fellow travelers. Some travelers journaled their way west, filling pages with descriptions of dust storms and buffalo sightings, river crossings and broken wheels. One man wrote only, "Day 92 buried another axle and my patience." A woman crossing via Panama described the jungle as a moist and godless place, which honestly feels like a pretty fair Yelp review. Whether by wagon, by ship, or by mule, each route wove together into a kind of national fever dream. Trails crisscrossed the continent and the oceans, converging toward one wild, teeming goal. Their maps may have been crude, but their resolve was not. And somehow, that was enough. Because at the end of the canyon, at the far edge of the continent, there shimmered something, real or imagined, that called louder than reason and longer than fear. Gold, of course, but also something deeper. A chance, a change, maybe even a new beginning. By the time spring melted into summer in 1849, San Francisco had gone from a sleepy coastal outpost to something that looked suspiciously like a tent city built by caffeine-fueled optimism and absolutely zero zoning laws. The transformation was dizzying. In less than a year, this foggy patch of western shoreline, originally a modest village called Yerba Buena, ballooned into a booming, shouting, sawing, hammering, wheel-squeaking port town stuffed with more strangers than plans. Ships arrived daily, their decks groaning under the weight of men, dreams, and barrels of things that were somehow already overpriced the moment they touched the dock. Many of those ships never left. Their crews deserted to go digging for gold, and the vessels were stripped and repurposed, turned into warehouses, jails, saloons, and occasionally very ambitious chicken coops. The harbor began to look less like a functioning port and more like the result of a shipyard sneezing. And on land? Oh, it was chaos with a view. The streets, if you could call the rugged, muddy paths that, heaved with movement. Men from every corner of the globe jostled through clouds of sawdust and tent canvas, past shouting vendors, hawking everything from shovels to whiskey that might also function as paint remover. You could buy a pickaxe, a shirt, and a tooth extraction without moving 20 feet, or possibly right from the same cheerful man with facial hair shaped like a small mammal. Prices? They broke every rule of supply and demand, except perhaps have gold, will charge too much. Eggs sold for $1 apiece, boots could cost the equivalent of a month's wages, and a simple cup of coffee was suddenly exotic enough to require negotiations. A laundress might charge $2 just to wash a shirt. And honestly, if you'd seen the shirt, you'd agree she deserved more. Scarcity fed inflation. Basic goods, nails, soap, actual drinkable water, vanished faster than a gambler's paycheck, and the word fresh became theoretical. Fresh meat, imported and salted, fresh vegetables, still on their way from someone's forgotten dream of farming. Fresh air, good luck. Once the wind turned and carried the scent of unwashed miners, horses, and something you really didn't want to ask about near the docks. Between the clamor of construction and the swirl of hopeful bodies, opportunity hung thick in the air, like sawdust laced with desperation. But opportunity is a slippery character, especially when everyone's chasing it with the same rusted shovel, and the same half-baked plan. Many newcomers set foot in San Francisco expecting to be off to the diggings by that afternoon, striking gold by Tuesday, and back home early next month with pockets jingling and an ill-advised hat collection. Instead, they found themselves stuck, either too broke to leave, too sick to travel, or slowly realizing that mining might be harder than the newspaper advertisements suggested. Who knew that gold didn't just leap into your pan like it was auditioning for a stage musical? So, some stayed. They pitched tents, built crude wooden storefronts, or simply carved out a space under the eave of someone else's venture. Others, clever or lucky, realized that the real money wasn't always in the hills, but in selling overpriced tools to the people heading there. Thus was born the gold rush's most ironic truth. The fastest way to get rich wasn't digging for gold, it was digging into the wallets of people who thought they would. Crime, naturally, settled in like an opportunistic raccoon. With no real police force, laws operated on a sliding scale of who was angriest and holding a larger stick. The town had jails, yes, but they also had vigilante committees with strongly worded opinions and a loose relationship with due process. Petty theft was rampant. Card games turned into brawls. And every saloon had at least one story that ended with someone flying through a window, even if they were on the second floor. But for all its grit and grime, something about San Francisco managed to feel electric. Maybe it was the smell of sawdust and possibility, or the way the fog rolled in each evening like a soft curtain, briefly making the chaos seem peaceful. Or maybe it was the endless noise, that symphony of hammering, shouting, laughter, and accordion music that reminded everyone they were part of something massive, messy, and new. It was, after all, a city in fast forward. 1 year before, it had barely registered on a map. Now, it was the place where the world collided, literally. You could hear 10 languages on a single block, taste dishes you'd never seen before, and end up sharing a campfire with a Prussian violinist who only recently realized he hated gold mining but loved baking bread. For some, San Francisco was just a pit stop, a place to rest, resupply, or mail a letter that might take 6 months to arrive but still carried all the hope ink could hold. For others, it became home. A strange, sticky, hard-edged home wrapped in fog and promise. And while the gold lay hundreds of miles inland, buried in riverbeds and mountain gulches, San Francisco was its beating heart, the noisy, chaotic pulse that kept the rush alive. And if you made it there, if you stood on its wooden piers with your boots sticking to spilled molasses and listened to the city breathe, you could almost believe the golden future had already arrived. Almost. But chances were you still had mud on your pants, a pickaxe that cost you 2 months' rent, and no idea what came next. Welcome to San Francisco, 1849. Don't forget your shovel, and maybe, just maybe, a second pair of socks. The trail east of San Francisco quickly lost all traces of coastal comfort. Gone were the salty breezes and clanging harbor bells. Ahead stretched hills that folded upward like a wrinkled rug, leading towards the Sierra Nevada. This was the final leg of the journey that had already demanded so much. Months on ships, weeks over plains, or days sloshing through Central American jungles. And yet, to most gold seekers, this last push felt like the real beginning. The roads inland were less roads than suggestions. Rutted paths wound their way through chaparral and rolling oak. eventually sloping into pine-thick forests where sunlight had to negotiate its way through branches. At some point, travelers realized they weren't walking through wilderness, they were camping in it, permanently, or at least until they struck it rich. Prospectors, men mostly, though not exclusively, in flannel corduroy or whatever hadn't yet disintegrated in the journey, spread out along the stream-fed valleys. They set up camps that ranged from reasonably sturdy to, I hope it doesn't rain. Tents were common, shacks appeared like mushrooms, and some just curled up under overturned wagons or pine boughs tied together with optimism. The rivers, though, oh, the rivers, they were the whole point. Cold, clear, narrow, or broad, they sliced through the rock-strewn foothills with an almost mocking nonchalance. On their banks, men crouched for hours swirling pans of muddy grit, hoping for that flash of yellow. Gold, when it showed itself, was deceptive. It caught the light with just enough arrogance to ruin a man's sense of logic. Was that a reflection? A leaf? A hallucination brought on by bad beans and too much sun? Still, everyone had a system. Panning was the most straightforward. A wide, shallow pan, part science, part wishful thinking, swirl, sift, squint, repeat. Then there was sluicing, more involved, requiring wooden channels and running water to do the heavy lifting. And for those who fancied themselves engineers, there was cradling, using contraptions that resembled baby rockers, but birthed nothing but disappointment and sore backs. And yet, hope floated through the valley like wood smoke. Some men claimed whole sections of riverbank with stakes and signs, though no one really agreed on whether those signs meant anything. One miner might announce Tobias Gold Claim, 1849, with dramatic flair, only for a dozen others to trample through smoking pipes and muttering, "Sure, Tobias." If a claim actually yielded something, that's when the real trouble started. Arguments, duels, or worst case, lawyers. Most of the day was spent ankle-deep in frigid water, fingers raw from digging, eyes strained from watching for that telltale gleam. By late afternoon, the camps began to bubble with activity unrelated to mining. Fires sparked to life, coffee boiled dark and bitter, and sourdough starter passed hands like a communal gold nugget. Night in the foothills was its own beast, cold even in summer. The pines whispered overhead, while coyotes sang unsettling lullabies. Men snored in chorus, some out of exhaustion, some out of desperation, not to hear what might be creeping in the underbrush. A few couldn't sleep at all, staring up at stars with blistered hands and wondering if they'd traded their homes for a mirage. There were no formal towns here yet, only names people started using without asking for permission. Hangtown Dry Diggings, Murderer's Gulch. Lovely. These pop-up communities ran on barter, rumor, and black coffee. You needed boots? Better hope someone had 2 pairs and a soft heart. Got a toothache? Ask Jim. He used to be a barber, or maybe a butcher. Close enough. Of course, there were entrepreneurs, the pick and shovel types who realized that while gold was uncertain, selling eggs, whiskey, or boots was a sure thing. Some even followed the camps with wagons turned stores. Those wheeled little economies that understood demand better than most banks. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer. The rivers that gave life to gold dreams also served as bathtubs, dish sinks, and occasionally confessionals, as men swore into the current about all the mistakes they'd made. Still, there was camaraderie, Strange, smelly, but real. Men who had nothing now shared everything: meals, rumors, and once an entire pair of socks, rotated hourly like some sacred relic. Yes, there were fights, and drinking, and men who, in the absence of any gold, tried to mine each other's claims, sometimes literally overnight. But there was also music. Fiddles that sounded like they were tuned by raccoons but still managed a tune. There were letters home, smudged, tear-streaked, or wildly embellished, sent from the nearest settlement that boasted a post office and the ability to read. The landscape itself was majestic and mildly terrifying. Steep slopes covered in pines, granite outcrops like molars poking through green gums, and a sky so wide it made everyone feel like a blip. The Sierra Nevada loomed to the east with snowy peaks that laughed at wagons and whispered promises of more gold just past that next ridge. Spoiler, no. But onward they came every day, more boots crunching over pine needles, more pans dipped into creeks, more men pretending they weren't utterly exhausted. The dream was durable if nothing else, and it needed to be. Gold was not gentle. It didn't care about mortgage notices tucked in coat pockets or children waiting back east. It shone just enough to keep you trying, and ignored you completely the moment you stopped. Still, the camps grew. The trails became road-ish, footpaths wide enough for mules and maybe even a wheelbarrow. And with every new shovel planted in the dirt, the gold rush rippled further, reshaping hills, rivers, and the people who chased the glint. By winter, the same rivers that had flirted with miners now turned ice-cold and vindictive. Many packed up, some pressed on, others vanished. Their names never recorded, their stories told only by rusted pans left behind, and shacks slowly sinking into moss. But for a while, for that season between first frost and first fortune, men kneeled in the rivers of California, chasing specks of metal the size of hope. And that was enough to keep them going. Almost. The rivers didn't look like treasure chests. They looked like rivers, cold, rocky, full of slippery stones, just waiting to twist an ankle and ruin a dream. And yet, this was where the magic supposedly lived, not in castles or vaults, but in the mud and shine of a Sierra Nevada stream. So every morning, before the sun had properly cleared its throat, men waded into that icy water like it owed them money. They stood ankle-deep, knee-deep, waist-deep, if they were particularly brave or particularly desperate. Their pants clung to their legs, heavy with meltwater that didn't care about ambition. With shivering hands wrapped around tin pans and cradles, carved from salvaged wood, they scooped up gravel and swirled it slow and steady, like they were churning soup for ghosts. The idea was simple. Gold is heavy. It sinks. So as the water swirled and the silt washed away, maybe, just maybe, a flash of yellow would stay behind, catching the morning light like it meant something. Most of the time, it meant nothing. Just mica, or fool's gold, glittering flakes that lied with spectacular confidence. Some men found a few grains, fewer found nuggets, and the rarest found enough to stop looking. Those were the stories that kept everyone else combing the creek beds like hungry magpies. These whispers of success, passed from campfire to campfire, grew wilder with every retelling. Someone knew someone who once met a guy who found enough gold to fill a boot, or a bathtub, or a small barn if the weather had been right. The riverbanks became makeshift towns, not so much built as flung together. Canvas tents formed crooked rows, their corners sagging under the weight of damp nights and too much hope. Between them, campfires crackled and coughed smoke into the trees. The smell of bacon, beans, and ambition hung in the air, not always in that order. Piles of firewood leaned against tree trunks, and blackened kettles hissed on the embers. Everything was coated in a thin film of soot and silt, including the men. Most had come from elsewhere, and they all looked it. City clerks, woodsmen, farmers, poets. In the gold fields, distinctions didn't matter. Everyone was equally unwashed and equally broke. They wore rough flannel shirts and wide-brimmed hats, slick with river mist. Some had boots with holes. Some had no boots at all. Mules picked carefully through camp, ears twitching, munching on whatever wasn't nailed down, including occasionally someone's hat. There weren't many women here, just enough to make the absence noticeable, and the conversation occasionally unhinged. The companionship was mostly male, mostly loud, mostly fueled by bad coffee and worse whiskey. Tensions flared easily, so did friendships. And the line between the two often depended on whether someone accidentally, or not so accidentally, panned on another man's claim. Claims were sacred, even if they were marked with nothing more than a stick and a gut feeling. A man might spend a week digging through a gravel bar the river had barely noticed, convinced that this was the spot, that fortune lived here, under this exact patch of damp gray mud. He could spend days hauling rocks, sweating into the icy current, chasing the glint of something permanent. And after all that, what he got might not cover the cost of the coffee he borrowed from his neighbor. But even that neighbor, who hadn't found a thing in weeks and now smelled faintly like despair and wet wool, kept digging. Because maybe tomorrow, maybe under the next rock, maybe in the fork of the creek where the water paused just long enough to wink. Hope, it turned out, was heavier than gold and more stubborn. There were men who had been here for months. Their hands were cracked from the cold, their backs stiff from bad beds and long days bent over a pan. Their beards had learned to grow wild. They talked less now, dreamed less loudly. But they kept working, not because they believed gold was waiting, but because they couldn't quite believe it wasn't. Evenings in camp came slowly, with toes numb and shirts stuck to backs like second skin. The sun dipped behind the hills and the air got mean. Fires flickered, casting long shadows on tent walls where stories and silhouettes danced side by side. Someone might bring out a fiddle or a harmonica with only 3 working notes. There was stale bread, maybe dried meat, probably beans again, but also laughter, raspy, tired laughter, the kind that rolls in like smoke and lingers. Some men wrote letters home, words scratched out in candlelight with hands that still shook from the river's cold. Others just stared at the flames, replaying the swirl of gravel and water behind their eyelids. A good day meant a few flakes of gold caught in a cloth pouch. A bad day looked the same, only quieter. There were dreams, though, not just asleep. Dreams woven into the rhythm of each pan, dreams that maybe this camp was temporary, that someday soon they'd be back east with a pocket full of gold and a story no one would believe. That maybe their names would be remembered somewhere other than a weathered claim sign now lost to time and moss. And yet, the river stayed cold, the days stayed long. The gold stayed hidden more often than not. Still, every morning, boots found their way back into the water. Because once you've chased a glimmer, Once you've believed, even briefly, that treasure might lie beneath your feet, it's hard to walk away without looking one more time, just in case. Morning arrived not with the chime of an alarm, but with the cold bite of damp air creeping through canvas, and the stiff protest of muscles that had spent the night knotted on uneven ground. Camp stirred quietly, without much talk, just the soft rustle of heavy blankets being thrown aside, the creak of men rising from bedrolls, and the initial coughs of lungs still adjusting to wood smoke and wet mornings. There was no rooster to crow, no coffee pot bubbling on a polished stove. Just the gray hush of dawn and a world that smelled like pine, ash, and sweat-soaked wool. A miner's day began the way it always did, fumbling for boots still wet from the day before, teeth gritted as frozen leather kissed warm skin. Breakfast, if you could call it that, came in the form of hardtack, maybe a strip of bacon if someone had a good trade the day before. A pan of beans was a luxury, and coffee, black, sludgy, and possibly more bitter than the local disputes, was both a comfort and a warning not to drink too fast unless you like surprises in your teeth. Then it was time to gather tools from wherever they'd been left, leaning against a rock, buried half in mud, or beside a creaky sluice box. Picks, shovels, pans. These were not the polished instruments of industry. They were beaten, bent at strange angles, and often repaired with whatever material was closest to hand. A broken handle might be replaced with a tree branch, a cracked shovel, wrapped in wire and hope. The walk to a claim was often short but steep, and always cold. The river valleys held on to the morning chill like an old grudge. Boots crunched into coarse gravel, and frost clung to every blade of grass. Silence wasn't rare. It was standard. The men weren't being unfriendly. They were simply too tired to waste words that wouldn't dig gold from the earth. Besides, what was there to talk about? The weather was bad. The gold was stubborn. The food was worse than both. Once at the water, there was a rhythm to it all. Slow, repetitive, back-breaking rhythm. For panners, it meant crouching at the riverbank, scooping gravel into a shallow pan, swirling it gently over and over again. The motion was hypnotic, swish, swirl, tip, examine. Once in a while, a flash of promise might catch the eye. A glint, a sparkle, something to make a man's heart quicken. Most days there was nothing, just mud, crushed dreams, and the growing suspicion that the only thing getting rich here was the local laundry, because everything a miner owned was perpetually drenched in either river water or sweat. Others worked in teams with rockers, wooden cradles shaken rhythmically to filter out gold from sediment. Two men might trade off, one feeding the hopper with dirt, the other rocking the cradle like a tired father trying to soothe a colicky baby made of crushed stone. There was something almost comical about it. Grown men relying on a machine that sounded like a lullaby and looked like a bookshelf with ambition. Pick and shovel men had it worse. They ventured into hillsides, carving out narrow shafts and tunnels with a level of optimism that bordered on delusional. The ground was hard, the sun unrelenting. Sometimes, the only shade came from their own shadows, and even those had a tendency to wander off by midday. The physical labor was punishing, striking, lifting, throwing, striking again. Each swing was a wager that the next clump of dirt might hold something shiny enough to matter. Breaks were brief and rarely restful. A strip of jerky, a few swigs from a dented flask, and maybe a private moment to stretch the lower back and remember what standing upright felt like. Conversation remained minimal. Most men didn't have the energy. And besides, you never knew if the fellow next to you might already be eyeing your claim. Miners weren't unfriendly by default, but the gold had a way of making neighbors watch each other a little too closely. The soundtrack of the day was an orchestra of tools scraping, striking, and clattering. The river gurgled indifferently. The wind occasionally stirred the treetops. And over it all hung the soft, persistent whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. Today your pan would gleam. Today your pick would hit something that clinked instead of cracked. Bodies ached by midday, backs groaned, hands blistered through gloves that had long since given up. Men squatted in poses that would make a yoga instructor cry, holding them for hours as they handled pans like fragile crystal. There were no lunch breaks, just hunger and necessity. Swigs of tepid water from a canteen, maybe a bite of last night's cornbread, if it hadn't become a science experiment in one's pack. By late afternoon, the sun turned into both a friend and an enemy, melting the chill, but baking the skin and highlighting just how very little gold had materialized. Still, they kept at it, long past when common sense would suggest stopping. There was always one more pan to rinse, one more spot to try. Hope didn't just whisper, it clung, stubbornly, like river mud to the hem of your trousers. By the time night crept in, men straggled back to camp slowly, steps heavy, faces blank. Some hunched further under the weight of disappointment. Others walked slightly lighter, because somewhere in their pouch rested a few lucky flakes, real tangible proof that today wasn't all wasted time. Clothes were not changed. They were simply peeled off, shaken a bit, and maybe rotated for freshness. Supper was a modest affair. Reheated beans, maybe a bit of tinned salmon if someone was feeling lucky or flush. A harmonica might make an appearance. Cards too, if hands weren't too sore to shuffle. But mostly it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after physical exhaustion has wrung out every last ounce of talk. Letters home were written in cramped handwriting by lantern light, the ink smudged by fingers too calloused to care. Still no luck, they might say. Try again tomorrow. A few embellished the truth, because hope wasn't just for the hills. It traveled with the mail, helping sweeten the words sent back east, where families waited with patience, prayers, and a growing sense that adventure might not always be lucrative. And then, sleep. Not the soft, luxurious sleep of feather beds and silence. No, this was the collapse of a body used to lifting far more than it wanted to. Sleep came fast, like a thief, but not for long. Nights were cold and dreams were restless. Some dreamt of gold hiding just beyond reach. Others dreamt of home, warm bread, and weeks without blisters. Then the sun would rise again, slow and indifferent. And the whole thing would start over. Another day bent over in pursuit of something shiny, mysterious, and maddeningly elusive. Because in the end, gold wasn't just a metal. It was a mirage, a muse, and sometimes a very expensive backache. Once in a while, rumor would slink into camp, smelling faintly of tobacco and exaggeration. A man over in Coloma had struck a vein so rich it cried when he hit it. A 16-ounce nugget, they said, roughly the size of a walnut, though always described with the trembling reverence usually reserved for holy relics or particularly good sausages. The tale would slither from fireside to fireside, each retelling shinier than the last, until half the valley was ready to abandon their own pits and go chasing someone else's luck. Never mind the facts, never mind that the lucky fellow usually turned out to be a cousin of a friend's barber's brother-in-law, and no one had actually seen said nugget with their own tired, sand-gridded eyes. But no one wanted to hear that. The gold rush was as much about imagination as it was about gold. And oh, how the imagination liked to wander when you'd spent 10 hours scraping mud off a rock that looked exactly like the last 14 rocks you'd scraped. Still, a few did find it. One man dug behind a tree stump and struck a pocket so fat he sent word back east and was never seen again, except in legend, where he supposedly opened a hotel, married a singer with ankles so dainty they caused a duel, and now sleeps on sheets made of silk and smugness. Then there was the story of Mary Ellen Pleasant, a black entrepreneur who lived in San Francisco and quietly invested in gold country businesses. She didn't pan or dig, not in the mud at least, but she made money, lots of it, by spotting opportunity where others only saw dirt. While the camps argued over who stole whose wheelbarrow, she was buying laundries and restaurants. You could almost hear her sighing at the amateurs. But for every such tale, there were dozens more that ended with a broken pickaxe, a fist fight in the dark, or a single night at the gaming tables that erased an entire season's labor. Ah, the gambling halls. That's where dreams went to get repackaged as drama. Red and gold interiors, thick with cigar smoke, piano music, and the collective groan of men losing everything, often while still covered in dust. You'd see them lean forward with the overeager optimism of a child trying to guess which cup hides the peanut. A glance, a card. And there it went. 3 months of back-breaking work lost to a man named Slim, who owned exactly 2 teeth and 1 annoyingly lucky hand. Then came the thieves. Not just the nighttime kind who stole pans and mules, but the well-dressed variety with names like Colonel and suspiciously new boots. They sold shares in non-existent mines and maps to places with names like Golden Elbow Creek, which, upon visiting, turned out to be a mosquito-infested ditch with the faint scent of betrayal. And let's not forget those who lost it all not in camps but in trust. Letters arrived from home confessing that a family farm had been sold, or a wife had remarried after 3 unreplied letters, unable to wait for a dream that had begun to feel more like a delay. You could see those men staring at the campfire, gold flakes in their dirty palms, unsure if they'd won anything at all. But still, the stories of success clung to the air like morning mist. There was always a whisper here, a sighting there. An old man stooped with arthritis, who suddenly walked into town bent under the weight of gold. A teenage boy, barefoot, sunburned, who found a nugget the size of a potato and promptly bought a suit, 3 pies, and a horse named Clarence. These occasional successes kept hope alive, even when the odds were roughly equivalent to finding a clean fork in the diggings. Men began to believe that wealth might be just one more swing of the pick away, just one more shovel of gravel, one more backache, the next pan, the next pocket, the next tomorrow. And so the mining went on. Not because it was working, per se, but because it might. Hope, after all, is the most reckless of currencies. It bought tents, tools, and too many rounds of bad whiskey. It bought dreams of boarding steamships home, waving gloved hands from polished decks, gold safely tucked into boots and belts. It bought stories told to wide-eyed children, or at least the idea that someday someone would care to hear them. Of course, the man who found enough gold to finance his own piano-playing saloon was always just leaving when you arrived. And the man who made 1,000 in a single night, well, he'd lost it the very next day, buying a pair of red velvet curtains and a dancing bear, as one does. By the time dusk settled over the pines and the fires cracked to life, the talk would start again, low and casual, the way one might discuss weather. Someone somewhere had found something, a sparkle in the gravel, a vein under an old log. Half the camp would mutter things like, "Good for him," or "I was thinking about heading that way anyway." They weren't jealous exactly, or at least not enough to say so aloud. But you could feel it in the way they looked at their own claims, wondering what they'd missed. There's something quietly tragic about a man covered in dirt, chewing on cold beans, dreaming of velvet curtains. But also something oddly hopeful. Because even if the gold never came, at least not in the form promised, some found other treasures. A new start, a way out, a good story. And sometimes that was enough. But sometimes it wasn't. Hangtown did not earn its name from a series of warm welcomes or scented pillow mints. No, like many burgeoning boomtowns of the California gold rush, it got straight to the point. And that point was usually at the end of a rope. Legend has it that 3 unlucky men stole a few ounces of gold and ended up decorating an oak tree with their necks. Justice in Hangtown was swift, severe, and occasionally spelled with a question mark. But then again, in a town where the population ballooned from 0 to hundreds in the space of a few gusty weeks, due process was more of a suggestion. Boomtowns like Hangtown, Rough and Ready, and Whiskey Flat didn't grow so much as explode into existence. One day, you might stumble across a peaceful valley or a particularly stagnant stream. And the next, bam, tents, tin roofs, and makeshift wooden shanties as far as the eye could squint. It was as if a Home Depot and a saloon had made a bet to see who could set up shop faster. Buildings were tossed together with haste and optimism, often by people with limited carpentry experience but abundant enthusiasm. Floors were optional. Doors mostly worked. Windows, when present, let in light, air, and the occasional curious raccoon. The local architecture could best be described as leaning bravely. The first permanent structure in many of these towns, almost always a saloon, sometimes 2, occasionally 3, because hope springs eternal, and also because one might run out of whiskey. These saloons were more than watering holes. They were town halls, message boards, and makeshift therapy centers, wrapped in cigar smoke and off-key piano playing. If a miner had a good day, he might celebrate there. If he had a bad day, he'd definitely celebrate there. There wasn't much middle ground. And oh, the names. Whiskey Flat sounded like a place that didn't believe in moderation. Rough and Ready had real, we'll figure it out later energy. Each of these settlements was a little island of chaos, founded on golden dreams and patched together by desperation. The streets, if you could call them that, were often muddy, filled with boot tracks, mule dung, and discarded ambitions. You could walk from one end of town to the other in 5 minutes, but you might be propositioned, robbed, married, or elected mayor along the way. Law enforcement, bless its optimistic heart, usually arrived late to the party. With no real system in place, the job of sheriff often went to whoever looked the least likely to run away. Occasionally, that person was trying to run away, but got distracted by civic duty or a poker game. Vigilante justice filled the vacuum. Minors' courts sprang up wherever disputes flared, which was roughly every 45 minutes. These courts were less about jurisprudence and more about making sure no one torched your tent while you were asleep. That said, some towns did attempt to class things up, rough and ready for a brief and delightful moment, actually seceded from the Union. In a decision that could only be described as both bold and poorly timed, they declared themselves an independent republic in 1850, only to sheepishly rejoin the United States 3 months later, when they realized it was hard to get mail or whiskey as a sovereign nation. Life in these towns was loud, dirty, and full of contradictions. Men danced with each other for lack of women, then got in fights about it. Church services were held in the same buildings that hosted gambling the night before, a sort of spiritual double booking. And on Saturday nights, the air buzzed with fiddle music, clinking glasses, and the occasional gunshot, though no one was ever quite sure whether it was celebratory or otherwise. In the gold rush, even the gunfire had multitasking energy. Sundays were quieter, not because of religious observance necessarily, but because most people were too hungover to commit sins effectively. Whispers of gold finds drifted down the muddy streets like smoke. Some young buck would swagger into town with a nugget the size of an egg and leave 2 days later without his pants. Others showed up in torn boots and left rich, though most just stayed exactly the same amount of broke, with slightly worse hygiene. The real gold wasn't just in the hills, it was in the rumors. You could build an economy on hope and hearsay. And as quickly as these towns appeared, they could vanish like a gambler's last dollar. A few weeks of dry pans and empty veins could reduce a thriving town to an eerie collection of empty bottles, broken chairs, and one confused chicken who forgot where she lived. Buildings sagged, signs faded. The laughter and music gave way to wind and silence. And then, just as suddenly, the next strike would be announced 50 miles east, and the whole circus packed up and moved on. Still, despite the grime, the grift, and the gunpowder, there was something undeniably electric about these places. They pulsed with the feverish hope of people betting it all, not just their money, but their strength, their names, their prospects. Some lost, some found just enough. Most walked away with stories that sounded better around a fire after a few sips of something strong. And if you ever passed through one of these towns in its brief moment of glory, you might have smelled fresh sawdust mixing with bacon grease, heard a harmonica playing off-key in the distance, and seen a skinny man dancing with a broom because it was the closest thing to a sweetheart for miles. It was chaos. It was chance. It was America on fast forward. And for a little while, it was home. The gold didn't glitter for long. For every story of a lucky strike, a man stumbling upon a gleaming nugget the size of a hen's egg, there were 100 more that didn't end quite so sparkly. For most 49ers, the reality of the California gold rush looked less like a treasure hunt and more like an endurance test set to the soundtrack of coughing, gunfire, and someone yelling that their claim had just walked away. Camps were overcrowded and chaotic, tents huddled shoulder to shoulder, forming muddy alleys and impromptu neighborhoods that reeked of sweat, smoke, and something that might have once been pork, but now just smelled like regret. With no real sanitation infrastructure, people relieved themselves wherever they could, often within a wheelbarrow's roll of where they ate. Cholera and dysentery spread like wildfire, only with less romantic cinematography. When one miner began running a fever, others quietly edged away, not because they were effective at quarantine, but because no one wanted to be the next to end up in a hastily dug grave under a crooked pine cross. And accidents. Oh, accidents were just part of the job description. Miners worked long hours swinging picks and shovels, sometimes from before dawn until the stars blinked awake again. Injuries were inevitable, like someone lost a finger to a falling rock, or got a face full of gravel from a misfired blast. There were no safety regs, no hard hats, just a homemade beard and a prayer. If a man tumbled into a sluice box head first, or got pinned under a landslide of loosened dirt and dreams, that was just Tuesday. There was a sort of whispered code in camps. If someone cried out, you helped. Unless, of course, they were a rival, then, well, it got a little more complicated. Theft was common. Gold dust was currency, and it didn't come with a receipt. A man could spend weeks panning a decent stash, only to wake up one morning to find his pouch gone and his faithful mule looking suspiciously unconcerned. Some thieves were subtle, slipping into tents like whispers and vanishing before dawn. Others were bold, waiting until a miner left to fetch water, and simply squatting on his claim with a shovel in one hand and a story about his uncle's cousin's dying wish in the other. Disputes turned bloody faster than a rattlesnake could blink. With law enforcement sparse, and sometimes laughable, think a man with a badge made from a bent spoon, many turned to vigilante justice. Accusations flew like bullets, which, incidentally, also flew. A simple argument over a boundary marker could become a footnote carved onto a rough pine coffin. Duels were rare but not unheard of. More often it was a shotgun behind a tent flap or a vicious brawl that ended with someone getting buried alongside their grudge. And yes, men vanished. All the time. Some slipped away under cover of night because they owed gambling debts or had made a few too many enemies. Others wandered too far into the hills and never wandered back. Some were likely buried in landslides, their bodies swallowed by the earth they'd been trying to rob. Others might have been swept downstream by sudden flash floods, their stories vanishing like their hats, bobbing away in the current. A few, it was whispered, were taken care of, permanently, by competitors who didn't like to share. Most were never found. They had no real records, no family nearby to ask questions, just a name scribbled in a bunkmate's notebook. Or not even that. In the end, the gold took more than it gave. It pulled men from homes, broke their backs, their hopes, and sometimes their minds. Shallow graves dotted the foothills, marked with sticks, stones, and sometimes nothing at all. The wind became the caretaker, brushing dust over the dead and memories alike. But still, more came. Because even amid the rot and ruin, the dream shimmered. There was always a story of someone striking it rich, just 2 valleys over. A man who bought a barber shop and never picked up a shovel again, or a young lad who found a nugget while just skipping stones. These mirages of success floated like bait above the muddy misery, keeping the desperate grinding away, knee-deep in freezing water and denial. And besides, what was the alternative? Go home and admit failure? Face that neighbor who warned you not to go? No, better to believe that the next pan would glint with promise, that your luck was still traveling but only slightly delayed. Truth was, California didn't care who you were. Banker, farmer, fugitive, it leveled everyone. The land gave sparingly and took swiftly. It fed on hunger, both literal and metaphorical. And by the time most folks figured that out, they'd already traded everything just to get there. One prospector, in a letter home, wrote that the hills seemed to whisper at night, not ghosts exactly, but a kind of echo, of men arguing, guns firing, picks hitting stone. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe not. Either way, he kept digging. Because hope, as it turned out, has a very poor sense of direction. But as the fog lifts from dreams of fortune, so too does it unveil the parts of the story no one quite etched into the gold pans and glory songs. While starry-eyed prospectors packed wagons and strapped on boots, believing they were headed into the age of opportunity, many more saw their worlds collapse beneath avalanche-sized consequences. For the indigenous peoples who had called California home for thousands of years, the gold rush wasn't a new beginning. It was the end of everything familiar. Their lands, once quiet and seasonal and full of ancient rhythms, were suddenly flooded by tens of thousands of strangers wielding shovels, rifles, and an unchecked sense of entitlement. Native villages were uprooted, hunting grounds destroyed, rivers rerouted or polluted. One moment you're fishing the same stream your grandfather fished, and the next it's been claimed, renamed, and clogged with muddy tailings and shirtless men arguing over gold dust and whiskey. Some tribes tried to adapt, trading with the newcomers, attempting uneasy alliances. But gold fever doesn't make anyone reasonable. It makes people territorial, impatient, and poorly hydrated. Militias were formed explicitly to drive native people out, or worse. Across the Sierra foothills, entire communities vanished, not in the ephemeral way of mining towns, but in the tragic, irreversible way history prefers to forget. And yet, they weren't the only ones pushed out of the promised land. See, the great egalitarian dream of the gold rush had some fairly exclusive fine print. If you weren't white, wealthy, and male, your welcome was, let's say, selective. Enter the Chinese miners, thousands of them, who arrived with hope folded carefully between their work clothes and woven sandals. Most came through San Francisco after enduring harrowing sea voyages, lured by tales of Gold Mountain, a place where they might earn enough silver to support their families back home. What they found was not a mountain of gold, but a mountain of paperwork, prejudice, and pickaxe blisters. While other miners staked claims and shouted about manifest destiny, the Chinese found themselves relegated to the leftovers, claims already abandoned for being too hard to work, too deep, or simply no longer believed to hold anything worth the effort. And then came the taxes. Because nothing says, "We're glad you came," like a crushing financial penalty for existing. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 specifically targeted immigrants, especially the Chinese, with fees that could equal more than a month's earnings. Spoiler, it didn't make mining any easier. But it did make it abundantly clear who was considered part of the California dream, and who was merely a tolerated inconvenience until the next law was passed. Even when they found gold, Chinese miners often had it stolen or were driven off their claims by violence or threats. Some American miners use fire, fists, or worse, to chase them away. In more than a few cases, accidents happened, the kind no one investigated, the kind that ended with silent, unmarked graves near rivers that no longer sparkle. And yet they stayed, not because they liked being harassed, but because home was too far to return to empty-handed. So they persisted, forming tight-knit mining teams, building entire Chinatowns in the hills, constructing intricate systems of water channels, and reworking old claims so efficiently that some American miners grumbled the Chinese could mine the dust out of the dirt, which honestly is a bizarre insult. It's basically saying they were too good at the job no one else wanted. And still, laws and local ordinances kept tightening around them like a muddy noose. They weren't allowed to testify against white people in court. So if someone robbed, beat, or even murdered a Chinese miner, good luck finding justice. The records often read more like diary entries of disappointment than anything resembling law enforcement. Elsewhere, Latin American miners, particularly those from Mexico and Chile, faced similar fates. Many were seasoned laborers with real mining experience. But such qualifications didn't amount to much when surrounded by picket fences of nationalism and suspicion. They too faced violence, legal exclusion, or were simply rounded up and deported. Because nothing says, "Thanks for your contribution," like a one-way escort out of town. People came to California chasing freedom and riches, but for many, it felt more like being funneled into a maze of new rules, unwritten biases, and permanent second-class status. Opportunity, it seemed, had a bouncer at the door. And it wasn't checking resumes. It was checking skin color, surnames, and accents. And yet, among the dust and discrimination, there was still endurance. Unbelievable endurance. The kind of slow, silent resilience that doesn't make headlines, but builds history in its own way. Chinese miners pooled resources, built schools and temples in hidden valleys. They developed underground networks of trade and support. Some later founded laundries or restaurants in town as mining dried up, industries no one else saw as valuable until suddenly everyone needed clean clothes and hot dumplings. And native communities, decimated though they were, did not vanish entirely. Some retreated further into the mountains, preserving language and ritual in secret. Others interwove their survival into the changing world, navigating the brutal present with ancient knowledge and sheer stubbornness. Because here's the truth, tucked beneath the lure of gold dust and glory. Not everyone who came to California during the rush was chasing wealth. Some were just trying to survive a world that had no intention of welcoming them. And yet they came anyway. They endured, built, rebuilt, and, against all odds, left traces that shimmer even now, not with the luster of gold, but with the quiet glow of persistence. So the next time you hear the words gold rush, remember it wasn't just a stampede for riches, it was also a collision of dreams and displacement, hope and hardship. And like all collisions, what's left behind isn't always easy to sort. Sometimes it's dust in the seams. Sometimes it's a name chiseled faintly into a rock. And sometimes it's a memory that refuses to be buried, no matter how deep the mine. While the dreamers sifted through mud and misery, chasing flakes of gold with shovels that fell apart faster than a miner's optimism, another breed of fortune hunter quietly flourished. These folks didn't swing pickaxes. They swung open storefronts, tent flaps, and crates full of supplies priced somewhere between outrageous and Did I just pay a week's wages for a pickled onion? Welcome to the real jackpot of the gold rush, selling the dream. It turns out, if you wanted to strike it rich in California, the smartest move wasn't to dig for gold. It was to sell shovels to the people who were digging for gold, literally. And at the going rate of up to $20 for a half-rusted shovel that might snap in two after one enthusiastic scoop, the math added up quickly. The miners wore holes in their boots and their bank accounts. Meanwhile, the shopkeepers and street vendors wore tidy aprons and matching smirks. You could buy a bag of flour, something as dull and unshiny as flour, for $100. Potatoes, $30 apiece. And while today you might grumble over a $12 brunch egg, in Boomtown, California, a single egg could set you back a whole dollar. $1 in 1850. That's the kind of egg you gasp at before eating in reverent silence, maybe naming your firstborn after the chicken. The real trick was scarcity. There were no supermarkets, just dusty wagons, crowded general stores, and men with dreams bigger than their pay. Demand surged faster than supply could catch up. So if you managed to import a barrel of pickles or a bale of canvas, congratulations, you were now a luxury dealer. Food, boots, whiskey, tools, tents, tobacco. It didn't matter what you sold, as long as you sold it fast and charged like you'd invented capitalism yourself. And the most legendary example? A man named Samuel Brannan. He wasn't a miner, he was a man with a printing press and a well-timed sense of drama. After buying up every pick, pan, and piece of gear he could find, he ran through the streets of San Francisco shouting, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" He was not, to be clear, just being helpful. The more miners he lured to the hills, the more pickaxes he sold, at prices that would make a modern hiker weep. Brannan became California's first millionaire, not because he found gold, but because he sold the tools of hope to the people who were desperate for it. Build a store, not a mine. That was the true secret. Some entrepreneurs got even more creative. If you couldn't sell to miners, why not serve them? Bathhouses popped up in certain towns, offering a rare luxury, hot water. Laundries did brisk business scrubbing clothes that had forgotten what color they used to be. Saloons, of course, were everywhere. If miners couldn't wash away the dirt, they could at least drown it in whiskey. And then there were the enterprising women, some of the sharpest operators in the West. A woman like Luzina Wilson, for instance, arrived in California with her family and promptly opened a boarding house. She charged miners a small fortune for meals, clean beds, and the wholly unfamiliar sensation of being cared for. She made more money cooking stew and baking pies than most men did chasing dreams in the riverbeds. That's not a joke, it's just accurate. Others opened restaurants, took in laundry, or ran shops that stitched buttons back onto ripped shirts. If you're imagining some grand hotel in a dusty town, slow down. These services often operated out of canvas tents, log cabins, or slapdash wooden sheds with no insulation, one chair and a strong smell of hope. Still, there was money in it. A modest pie could be bartered for a miner's week of earnings, and he'd thank you for it. Even the tents themselves, those wobbly homes away from home, were often sold at criminal markups. A humble canvas tent could cost upwards of $200. For context, that didn't include floors, windows, or anything you'd call privacy. Just white flaps and a faint illusion of shelter. Some fortunes came in on steamships, Entrepreneurs from the East Coast or Europe brought with them crates of supplies, loaded down with hammers, tobacco, canned goods, you name it. The moment the ship docked, locals would scramble aboard to buy up stock, even before it hit the sand. The more remote your town, the higher your prices. If a product had to travel on muleback over mountains, cross deserts, and survive a few attempted robberies, it became an instant luxury item at the end of the line. At the very bottom of this golden supply chain stood the pack mule, unsung hero of the West. These sturdy animals carried more than freight. They carried fortunes, and their owners, often wealthier than the miners they trudged past. If your mule didn't spook, bolt, or simply give up mid-trail, congrats, you were in business. And really, that's what Gold Rush California was about for many. Business, not glory, not gold, just good old-fashioned supply and demand, with a bit of dramatic flair, a pinch of chaos, and a healthy disregard for standard pricing. Of course, it wasn't all profit and picket fences. Some merchants failed spectacularly. Imported eggs didn't always survive the voyage. Whiskey could be watered down beyond legality. More than one hopeful store owner arrived too late, set up shop in a dying town, and realized, too late, that the miners had moved 50 miles upriver overnight. Still, when you trace the biggest fortunes of the gold rush, you'll find not a shimmering nugget, but a receipt, a ledger, a cash box beneath a counter stacked with boots, beans, and broken dreams. In the end, the real gold wasn't in the streams. It was in the stew pots, the ropes, the shovels, and the tents. The dreamers bought hope by the barrel. And the sellers? They laughed all the way to the bank, assuming there was one. If not, a strong box under the bed worked pretty well too. Some of the letters were heartbreakingly sweet. Scratched in shaky graphite or flourished pen nib, they began with things like, "Dearest Sarah," or "My darling Ellen," or occasionally, "Mother, please sell the cow." Many were folded carefully into tight squares, sealed with wax or saliva, and tucked into buckskin satchels or handed off to overworked postal clerks with ink-stained fingers and sympathetic eyes. Most letters made it out, some didn't, and quite a few were never written at all, because their intended authors didn't live long enough to finish them. The California Gold Rush wasn't exactly a postal service dreamscape. The trails were muddy, the routes were dangerous, and trying to get a letter from a mining camp outside Coloma to a farmhouse in Ohio, that required timing, luck, and a mail carrier with both a good horse and a concerning disregard for personal safety. Some letters were months old by the time they arrived. Others were lost entirely, drifting into that mysterious archival afterlife, alongside mismatched socks and the concept of punctuality. But oh, the hope that poured out of them. "I've found a promising spot," one miner wrote. "Tell the children I shall return with riches beyond imagining." Which, if you know how most mining ventures went, is an adorable level of confidence. That man probably spent his days bent over in a cold creek, swatting at mosquitoes and wondering if mica sparkles count as good enough. For many, writing home was a comfort, something to do by lantern light after a long day of digging and disappointment. They'd describe the land, endless hills, sun so bright it bleached their hats, rivers that glimmered cruelly just enough to keep them going. They'd say how close they were to a real gold find, how a man 2 tents over had just pulled a nugget the size of a walnut, how they would send for the family soon, just as soon as the next claim came through. And they meant it. Most of them did. But a lot of those families never heard back. The thing is, people vanished in California during the gold rush. Not in a ghost story way. Although, let's be honest, California had plenty of those too. But in a quieter, more heartbreaking way. Some fell ill. Others ran out of supplies and options. Some got involved in disputes that ended with a shovel to the head. Many simply drifted, changing camps, changing names, chasing fortune, until they wore out. The West swallowed them whole. And back home, their families waited. The postal routes did their best. Sometimes, letters bounced through half a dozen hands, passed from ferries to wagons to mules. Once in a great while, a miner would send his message with a fellow traveler heading back east, wrapped inside a tattered kerchief and guarded like treasure. But between weather, theft, and the occasional bout of, "I forgot I was carrying that," many letters never found their way. There's something haunting about that, isn't there? Whole lives lived, and often lost, with only partial documentation. Letters half written, maybe tucked inside a bedroll. Stories that stopped mid-sentence. A miner promising he'd write again, only for that scrap of paper to be the last thing anyone back home ever heard. Some families held on to those final letters like relics. They read them over and over until the ink faded and the creases wore through. Others couldn't bear it, tucking the pages away in drawers that were later emptied by curious grandchildren who wondered who this Ellen was and why someone had drawn a tiny shovel in the margins. Even for those who did make it back, and some did, it wasn't always easy to reconnect. Years passed, children grew up, the house was sold, memories shifted like riverbeds during spring melt. A man who left as a young farmhand might return a grizzled stranger with a limp, and stories no one believed. "Oh sure, Grandpa, you and the grizzly bear fought over a gold pan. Yes, that sounds very plausible." Some miners tried to keep journals instead, a sort of one-man archive. These too were subject to disaster. Rain-soaked tents didn't do wonders for paper, and neither did lantern fires, whiskey spills, or raccoons with boundary issues. In truth, the West wasn't kind to paperwork. It was better at erasing than recording. Even official records, claim forms, census notes, land deeds, often read like suggestions etched into fog. Entire minor towns vanished, leaving behind nothing but broken bottles, collapsed wooden frames, and the occasional rusty horseshoe that might now sit behind someone's bar as authentic decor. But not all letters disappeared. Some made it. Some were read aloud around fire-lit kitchens with proud voices and trembling hands. "Your pa's doing all right," someone's mother would say. "He's digging near Sutter's Mill and says the season looks good." And even if it wasn't true, the paper smelled of pine and campfire smoke. That was enough to believe. A few letters even became wildly optimistic business pitches. One enthusiastic prospector tried to convince his brother to mortgage the family farm and start a pickaxe shop. "There are so many men out here with dreams and empty hands," he wrote, "and I know just where to buy handles in bulk." It wasn't a terrible idea, honestly. Selling tools to dreamers paid better than most mining claims, but optimism frayed with time. Later letters often told a different story, of loneliness, dwindling rations, bad whiskey, and the kind of cold that settles in your bones and starts charging rent. And then, silence. Not always dramatic, just silence. The last letter came, and then no more. The family waited a little longer. They asked around, maybe sent someone to check. But the trail got longer and the path more vague, until he went to California became less of a plan and more of a myth. That's how legends are made. A man walks into the hills looking for gold. He doesn't come back. His name becomes a whisper, then a tale, then an anecdote told in a saloon about that one fella who supposedly found a nugget so big he disappeared with it. No one knows where he went, but someone finds a journal page in an old trunk or a letter folded into a Bible, and for a moment he's there again, smiling through dirt-streaked cheeks, asking someone to give his love to Sarah. It's a reminder that history isn't always built from battles and treaties. Sometimes it's built from postage stamps and paper smudged with creek water, from sentences that start, "I miss the corn back home," and end with, "Maybe next month I'll strike it big." And in between, just silence. But a silence full of hope, despair, and the unmistakable sound of pencil scratching out one more promise on thick, yellowed paper. By the mid-1850s, the roar of the California gold rush had quieted to a murmur. The rivers that once gleamed with flakes of gold in the morning sun now mostly offered fish, and even those were starting to look nervous. If you arrived after 1852, chances were you missed the great glimmering buffet. The easy pickings were gone, scooped, sifted, and stashed by the early birds who had gotten very rich, moderately lucky, or just really good at exaggerating their success in letters home. The individual prospector, that rugged figure with a pan in one hand and eternal optimism in the other, was becoming something of a myth. Not extinct, just increasingly irrelevant, because while lone miners still poked around the hills and streambeds, the treasure map had changed. X no longer marked a spot you could reach by mule and determination. Now, X required investment capital, a water wheel the size of a barn, and preferably a few dozen employees who didn't mind getting wet and yelled at. Enter the mining companies, larger, richer, and considerably less poetic. These industrial outfits arrived with powerful equipment, hydraulic monitors, stamp mills, sluice systems, like something out of a fever dream. If you're picturing a surprising number of pipes, gears, and men yelling over the sound of rushing water, you're not far off. They weren't here to pan. They were here to rip the hills open and shake out whatever gold dared to be hiding inside. Hydraulic mining, in particular, was the new star of the show. Imagine a massive water cannon aimed at a hillside, blasting away soil and rock to reveal flecks of gold like some aggressive mole extermination plan. It worked brilliantly for the companies. Not so much for the hills, the rivers, or the farmers downstream who suddenly discovered their orchards buried under slurry and mud. Environmental concerns weren't really on anyone's radar yet, but if hills could file complaints, the Sierra Nevada would have been very loud in the 1850s. This shift didn't just change the landscape, it changed the people. The rough and ready prospector population began packing up. Some headed home with tales of glory and no actual gold. Others shifted into different roles: shopkeepers, stagecoach drivers, occasional outlaws. A few simply wandered off into the wilderness and became something between hermit and legend. You can still find reports of bearded men muttering about lost veins of gold and talking to squirrels with suspicious familiarity. Towns that once pulsed with life began to thin out. Some, like Hangtown, managed to evolve into proper settlements. Many others deflated like soggy tents, their residents evaporating with the promise that something anything might glint somewhere else. Wooden structures were left to lean awkwardly in the wind. Empty whiskey bottles sunbathed on saloon counters. Some towns became ghost towns in the most literal sense, empty, eerie, and very popular among photographers with a flair for dramatic lighting. But if the gold was mostly gone, its fingerprints remained everywhere. In the roads carved through mountains, the buildings erected in desperate hope, the laws that had suddenly sprung up to manage mining rights and property claims. California itself had transformed from a rugged remote region to a central hub of American ambition. The rush may have slowed, but the momentum it built didn't stop. Railroads were coming. Banks were moving in. Politicians were taking notes, and occasionally bribes. The social makeup of the region had changed too. The wild melting pot of nationalities that once shook hands over panned dust now had to adjust to different rules. Instead of staking claims, many had to apply for jobs with the very companies that edged them out. It was less romantic, sure, but sometimes a steady paycheck trumped a gold nugget you'd never find. Still, for non-white miners, those paychecks were elusive. Racist laws and taxes hadn't gone anywhere, and many Chinese and Mexican workers continued to be pushed into lower-paying labor or entirely off the terrain. For women, too, the story shifted. The entrepreneurial few who had thrived by feeding and housing miners often now catered to company men, or, seeing the writing on the canyon wall, relocated to growing cities like San Francisco or Sacramento. The tent-turned-cafe might be packed and folded, hauled away on a wagon, waiting for the next surge of dreamers to find something to chase. The atmosphere was different now. Less carnival, more corporation. There were still bar fights. This was still the Wild West, after all. But they now happened under the glow of oil lamps in more established inns, accompanied by the distant echo of paperwork. And yet, the dream lingered. It always does. While most of the easy gold was gone, whispers of rich strikes still danced through spring-fed canyons and dusty boarding houses. Some claimed they knew the spot. Others said nothing but stared at maps until dawn. And always there was the traveler, arriving too late, but still asking directions. Some miners stuck it out, working harder for smaller yields. They measured their worth in ounces, not pounds, and in grit, not glitter. They drank cheap whiskey and shared stories that got shinier each time. They lost teeth, found religion, and occasionally found gold, just enough to keep believing. You can almost still hear them up there in the Sierras, where the air thins and the trees lean in close. A clink of metal, a muttered curse, the sound of boots sinking into wet gravel. The promise of fortune had faded, but it hadn't vanished. That was the thing about the gold rush. It didn't end. It just changed shape. From rivers to railroads, from claims to contracts, from mountainside dreams to corporate offices with carpet. And so, while the gold itself ran dry, the hunger it inspired dug in deep. California had become a place where fortunes were made, if not in gold, then in land, trade, citrus, oil, and eventually, movies and microchips. But that early glint, that gleam that pulled thousands west, it never really left. It just got paved over, hidden under highways and Trader Joe's parking lots. So if you do find yourself wandering in gold country someday and pick up a shiny rock, don't get your hopes up. But maybe do hold it for a moment. And remember the people who once thought it might just be their future, Just don't try to pan the Sacramento River. The fish are tired enough as it is. But some didn't return to the mountains. Some simply stayed. They packed up their pans, wiped the last fleck of gold dust from their calloused hands, and looked around. The golden hills, once glittering with possibility, had quieted. The roar of rushing creeks faded to a murmur. Maybe they'd found a nugget or two. Maybe just enough to bait hope and keep the lights on. But for many, what they discovered wasn't gold. It was something almost weirder. A sense of place. California had stopped being a gamble and started being an option. And so, the shovels went away. The claimed stakes were pulled from the earth like crooked teeth, and in their place sprouted general stores, post offices, and, inevitably, someone's cousin trying to start a bakery. Sometimes the transition was simple. A miner sold his tools, bought a corner lot, and suddenly he was Mr. Jenkins, proud proprietor of Jenkins and Sons Dry Goods. Other times, it was less neat. Dreams died loudly back then, clattering into barroom floors and echoing out through argument and debt. But even that kind of noise softened over time, replaced by the regular thump of hammers driving nails into timber and futures. Some found love, or something close enough to it after a few drinks. Marriages bloomed, between people who had nothing left to chase except each other. Former prospectors married local women, sometimes Mexican or indigenous, sometimes the enterprising daughters of other settlers who'd arrived with more practical ambitions than gold fever. Children followed, wide-eyed and dusty-kneed, clattering through half-built towns and asking questions like, "What's a miner?" as their parents tried not to laugh and cry at the same time. They fenced off little plots of land, built homes that leaned slightly to the left but held firm through storms, planted vegetables and hoped for the best. The gold they hadn't found in rivers, they now tried to grow from dirt. These weren't grand estates. Most were rough cabins or hastily repaired adobe structures, with wood stoves that smoked no matter how many times you adjusted the flue. Chickens ran free, dogs ran freer, and every morning smelled vaguely of bacon grease and unfulfilled ambition. The newly minted residents learned to deal with the weather. Shoes full of dust in the summer, floods that carried away your outhouse in winter, and more than a few earthquakes that inspired sudden prayers and awkward apologies shouted at the sky. And yet, they stayed. Some opened taverns or barbershops. A few traded picks for printing presses, turning their mining journals into the town's first newspaper, complete with typos, gossip, and rants about mule thieves. Others became informal mayors, not elected, just loud, and always holding a broom for emphasis. There was even happiness, that fugitive of the frontier. Not all the time, no one's that lucky, but enough to notice, enough to keep going. California, once the distant land of El Dorado dreams and map-edge monsters, slowly became something far more intimate. A place where kids learned to walk, gardens failed heroically, and birthdays were celebrated with burnt cakes and off-key fiddle tunes. A place where people stopped searching for treasure because they were too busy making dinner. Some towns became permanent. They got real names, not just things like Rough and Ready or Murder Gulch, although, of course, some of those stuck. Streets were laid out, schools opened, sometimes in old saloons where your teacher might still smell a bit like whiskey and regret. Churches appeared too, modest wooden things where sermons were shouted to the rhythm of rain on the roof. By the end of the 1850s, the gold rush had turned into something else entirely. Not a story of striking it rich, but of staying put, of choosing stability over spectacle. Not everyone left with a fortune, but many built lives that arguably were richer in the long run. Not that that would have comforted their younger selves, knee-deep in mud and disappointment back in '49. And as with all things on the edge of civilization, contradictions abounded. Some settlers grew wealthy not from gold, but from land speculation, buying up tracts and waiting for the town to grow toward them, like ivy towards sunlight. Some profited from agriculture, discovering that almonds, peaches, and walnuts were kinder than gold veins. One might even say nuttier, but were being respectful. Others found themselves in shades of gray. Marrying into established California families brought land and tension. Neighborhood dances could be charming affairs or exercises in barely restrained land disputes with a side of cake. Even former vigilantes mellowed out. The same man who once strung up a cheat over $5 might now be arguing politely at a town meeting about whether Main Street needed a second well. Time has a funny way of sanding down even the sharpest edges. And all the while, California changed. It wasn't just the land of the hopeful, it had become the land of the hopeful's consequences. Towns that stayed, families that rooted, names that stuck on mailboxes and maps. It wasn't flashy. It didn't make headlines or travel across oceans. But it was real. The people who stayed accepted that the real gold might have been security or community, or knowing your neighbor wouldn't secretly disappear in the night with your wheelbarrow. So they painted fences, took deep breaths, waited out mosquito seasons, watched sunsets spill across the Sierras, like someone had sliced open the sky and let all the colors out. No one could be sure what they'd find when they first stepped off those boats, cross-country wagons, or exhausted mules. But by the time they put away their pickaxes, they had something better than a lucky strike. They had a home. The sky is darker now. Not the ink blue of early night. Not the gold-tinted dusk that used to linger over the diggings. But that deep velvet black you get when everyone's finally gone home. The kind of night that softens the edges of everything, mountains, memories, regrets, and lays them out in the cool hush of forgetting. The camps once full of raucous dreams and louder arguments have settled into silence. No more clanging pans, no more fiddle tunes spilling out of canvas saloons with names like Mother Lode or the Pickaxe and Flask. The wind hums over the ghost of a main street where the dirt has long since swallowed boot tracks and whiskey stains. A lantern hangs crooked on a nail, swinging gently, creaking its tiny song into the emptiness. No one is there to straighten it. Maybe somewhere, a raccoon is stealing a long-forgotten biscuit from inside a caved-in grub tent. An accidental inheritance. The rivers, once churned with ambition and sediment, now ripple quietly over rusted shovels and broken sluice boxes. Their banks are overgrown, their currents lazy. They remember the way hands used to tremble when they caught sight of a flash in the pan. Gold, or just sun on quartz. Hard to say now. The river doesn't argue, it just flows on. Not that time forgot the gold fields. It just decided not to call too often. There were thousands of claims staked with hope, and just as many abandoned in frustration, left behind. A few splintered signs nailed to trees, names written in charcoal, slowly eaten by bark. Jim's luck. Caroline's fancy. God willing. The trees have done what trees do, kept growing, without much interest in human affairs. Can't blame them. A cabin still stands in one valley, a lopsided thing cobbled from old freight crates and pine. Its doors open, half off the hinges, as if someone once left in a hurry but meant to come back. Inside is a stove, rusted shut, a cracked tin cup, a single boot, lonely and suspiciously mossy. Let's hope its partner got a better ending. Sleep comes easy here now. No more gunshots echoing through the gulch at midnight. No more coyotes startled by singing miners who had one too many from a jug labeled medicine. Instead, just the soft chorus of frogs, the patient hum of crickets, the quiet settling of dust. A few headstones remain, their carvings worn smooth by time, wind, and the occasional curious deer. Gone prospecting, one reads, with a tilted wink at eternity. Another simply says, Brown, 1852. No one remembers if it was Malachi, Marcus, or just Minor. There are no ghosts here. Not the scary kind, anyway. Just the gentle residue of ambition. The kind that crackles the air during a storm. The kind that keeps people awake at night wondering, just wondering, what if? Out in the hills, nature has tried her best to reclaim the punctures and scars. Hillsides once scraped by hydraulic cannons are now soft green in spring, gold in summer. The scars are still there, just quieter. Like a miner who doesn't talk about that one winter. And somewhere, out in some half-swallowed trail between two long-forgotten towns, there's a tiny sprout pushing up through the planks of what used to be a dance hall floor. It doesn't know about the gold rush. It doesn't care. But it grows anyway. The men and women who stayed, some of them were never trying to get rich. They were just trying to live. They built homes with leftover boards from abandoned flumes. They planted gardens in old panning troughs. They found peace in the quiet, and occasionally a goat in the outhouse. Life happens. Even the stories are tired now, content to drift. The ones spun in bunkhouses and under starry skies, about nuggets the size of fists, about close calls with bears and worse, bank managers. They're still there, tucked into the air like the last embers of a campfire, flickering, fading, never quite out. Tonight the goldfields sleep not with glittering treasure, but with stories tucked into the soil like seeds. Stories of people who didn't strike it rich, but did strike something, purpose maybe, or at least a good pair of boots. So rest easy, traveler, whether you're miles away or just tucked up in bed with your mind wandering west. The gold is gone, or at least the kind that glitters, but the hush remains, soothing and soft, like fog curling over the foothills before dawn. The rush is over. Let the land sleep. Let the myth settle. And you can close your eyes now too.